Hi, Brian.
Hi, Bob. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you?
Not too bad.
You are joining us from Chicago, is that right?
That is.
And you are a reporter, a journalist based in Chicago. And you write or co-write a blog on Yemen. And I guess it's a tribute to your prescience that you were doing so well before Christmas when Yemen again entered the headlines because the so-called underwear bomber was apparently trained and equipped there by al-Qaeda.
I'm sorry.
And you've been, and how did this start? I want to talk today about Yemen and about the al-Qaeda threat and whether there's anything we can do. But for starters, I'm curious how you wound up in the Yemen part of the blogosphere. And what's the name of your blog, too?
The name of the blog is al-Waq.
And that presumably is not English.
No, that actually refers to a series of mythological islands that are off the coast of Yemen. They're kind of part of Yemeni ancient lore. And me and my co-blogger, Gregory Johnson, have always kind of been fascinated by them and thought, we'll name our blog after it. No one will know what it means, but it's fun to say.
It is Waq al-Waq, yes.
Yes.
How did I do?
That's perfect.
Thank you. So you got interested in Yemen when and how, and when did you spend time there?
Well, I guess it was a long time ago. Greg and I actually met in Cairo or studying down there. And Yemen, even for people who were studying the Arab world, or even people in the Arab world, Yemen was always kind of the exotic outside backwaters place that no one knew too much about. As a younger person, that was kind of fascinating. Then as I studied it more throughout, the first half of the last decade, realized that based on its demographics, its history, its politics, that it was running out of oil and water, we realized that Yemen was soon going to become one of the more important countries when dealing with Islamism and with al-Qaeda, because it was really on the verge of falling apart. And there was a to use a cliche, the perfect storm of issues brewing there. And so that, I found that really interesting. So combined with just, it does have a really fascinating history and beautiful architecture. So everything kind of led to Yemen.
So you spent how long there and when?
About 6 months in 2004. And then have had trouble getting back since.
Yeah. I would imagine. But you've been writing about it
yes, I have.
Frequently ever since. Now, what I'd like to do is first kind of get your take on the threat to the United States that is there, in other words, al-Qaeda, and the nature of it, and then back up and talk about Yemen's various problems that make it hospitable to kind of outlaw groups in general and al-Qaeda in particular, and then talk at the end a little about what can be done. So. What is the nature of the al-Qaeda presence in Yemen?
The nature of the al-Qaeda presence is that, if I can talk a little bit about the history of this group for a minute, the al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula.
Sure, which is to be distinguished from al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia, I gather, which got so much play during the heart of the Iraq War.
I think that's actually a really important distinction, and I'll get to that in a minute. But basically what we're dealing with in Yemen is the second generation of al-Qaeda in Yemen. The first generation, which had their biggest attack on the USS Cole, of course, and the French tanker the Limburg in the early part of the early 2000s, were largely eliminated by a combination of Yemeni and American might and arrests, assassinations using drones, and they were largely eliminated almost entirely, and their troops were demoralized. But then the problem is, the U.S. attention went elsewhere, obviously, and President Ali Abdullah Saleh, who'd been running Yemen at that point for some 25 years and who's still in power, his attention went to other internal difficulties that he was facing, which we can get into those in a little bit as well. So in that interim, a bunch of militants who were arrested, some who were coming back from Afghanistan, some coming back from Iraq, broke out of prison almost 4 years ago in February of 2006. And two of them, Nasser al-Wuhayshi and Qasim al-Raymi, are the ones who formed the newest al-Qaeda group in Yemen. And what distinguishes them from their counterparts, from their predecessors, is that they're much more ruthless. They're not willing to deal with the government at all. They're not willing to make deals, bargains. They're more ambitious and they're more patient. And what they really want is to become the number one franchise of al-Qaeda in the world.
And that entails what kind of short-term goals? I mean, we know that they had a role in the underwear bombing. What would you say their agenda is right now?
I would say their agenda is to help facilitate the fall of the central government, such as it is, through a series of attacks, through trying to turn people against the central government, and aiding, not necessarily with weapons or anything, but just aiding to the general chaos caused by the rebellion in the north and the secessionist movement in the south. Mm-hmm. And if they can do that, if they can completely help the government fall apart, then they'll be able to have a lot of operational space in which to plan.
Mm-hmm. And they are, of course, on the border of Saudi Arabia, and I gather that there's no love lost between them and the Saudi regime.
No, they're not. There is no love lost, you're right. And the problem with al-Qaeda is that they're not just in one area. They're in several provinces around the country. And what they're doing is, what makes them really interesting and scary is that they've managed to insinuate themselves into the social fabric of the country, especially the tribal system. Mm-hmm. We have a lot of reports of al-Qaeda people marrying into the tribes, so that when the U.S. government or the Yemeni government goes after al-Qaeda, you're not just going after a militant, you're going after a tribesman. Mm-hmm. And so that's helping. And what Saleh's done to maintain power for the last 30 years is a careful balance of patronage and maintaining relationships with the tribe.
This is the president.
And that's all falling apart now.
Mm-hmm. And how much sympathy for al-Qaeda is there among the people there?
Well, it's an interesting question, because there does seem to be a good amount, but it's not necessarily indicative of any latent sympathy towards Islamism. One of the problems is that al-Qaeda, besides just marrying into the tribes and being part of the social fabric, is it's couching its language in Yemen in terms of, in almost a secular manner, which is that it's saying, the government is corrupt, it tortures people, it's not helping, it's not giving you any money, look at this, we're running out of water, you can't feed ourselves. So in many ways, al-Qaeda, it really is one of the most representative groups in the country, because they manage to be all things to all people. Mm-hmm. People with militant leanings and Islamist leanings see them as, the vanguard of their movement. Even people without that, even people who aren't militant Islamists, respect and admire them for what they're doing against the president, who's lost almost all of his popularity.
Okay, and his unpopularity translates into their popularity.
Exactly.
To some extent.
They're working to
but I gather, but it isn't quite like the Taliban, where people turn to them as the only available source of order. In other words, the way the Taliban initially took control in Afghanistan.
Right, because the thing is, with Yemen, it has a history where central government is observed more in the breach than in practice.
Right.
And so, with al-Qaeda being part of the tribal society, then they don't have to say, we can step in for the central government. They say, when the central government falls apart, this little section that you're living in now, your tribes, we're here.
Right, and moreover, the tribal authority was the source of order to begin with. If there was never much centralized control, right?
Right, even the imam, who should have been running most of the north, was very rarely worked outside of his base.
So it's not that they turn to al-Qaeda, as an alternative to chaos. But it is that the demise of the central government is correlated with the rise of al-Qaeda because they exploit the unpopularity.
Right, and I think for a lot of people in Yemen, this devolution of power is more of a return to the norm than it is something that's terrifying.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so their agenda now is. America, you would say, is not at the top. Obviously, they don't mind causing us harm if they played a role in this attempted underwear bombing, but we're kind of not at the top of their agenda?
I don't believe so. Any strike against America is good for them. Obviously for them.
You're not speaking for yourself here. Right. We should clarify that, yes.
Thanks for clarifying. Yeah.
Sure. That'll save you several dozen comments in the forum.
I appreciate that. What I think it does for them, essentially, even if the attack's unsuccessful, it shows other people around the world, especially other al-Qaeda groups, that, hey, we are the ones with the means now to launch a strike against the far enemy, against the great Satan, whatever militant term that jives with you right now. And so it's not necessarily that they want to attack America qua America. It's what it represents, what their ability to do so represents for them in the militant community and in the world of the jihadis.
Mm-hmm.
So this strike, I mean, they didn't really lose very much. They sent somebody who wasn't a member of the organization, and yeah, they didn't train and equip them as well as they could have, but now everyone's paying attention to them, much more than they're paying attention to bin Laden.
Which they like.
Which they very much like, yeah. That helps with funding, and that helps to, improve their reputation.
And where does the funding come from? I mean, if you say it helps with funding.
Right now, it's actually kind of vague where that's coming from. There's reputed ties with smugglers, with Somalia. They've had actually a series of really dramatic bank heists. Right now, I don't think they're very wealthy. I don't think they're well off.
But in terms of donors from outside of Yemen, they're getting publicity is a good thing.
Yes.
And as I said, I want to save most of the kind of what do we do about this question for the end after we get into Yemen's own problems. But clearly we have this kind of, just based on what you've said, it sounds like we have kind of a dilemma, which is that our instinct in fighting al-Qaeda is to ally with the government to do that. Mm-hmm. And yet, as you said, the government is unpopular, and its unpopularity gives al-Qaeda strength. And so I assume that by identifying ourselves with the government, we are not exactly enhancing our own popularity among the people at least among some people in Yemen.
You're exactly right. Yeah, that's kind of the Sharian nightmare that we have when trying to deal with this.
Mm-hmm.
Is that our best partner is also our worst partner.
And one little related question before we get into Yemen writ large. You said that the first generation of al-Qaeda had been pretty effectively contained until this big jailbreak. Mm-hmm. And one of the means of containment was drone strikes. I remember the first time after 9/11 I read about a drone strike, it was about Yemen. And I remembered very clearly because I emailed a friend and said, this seems kind of like, so are we now in the business of just like assassinating people in countries all over the world? Now, I gather that you can reassure me that at least had the support of Yemen's government. But there's also a little interesting tidbit. I gather the Bush administration chose to publicize that rather than keep it secret, right?
Right. The backstory is supposed to be that the leader of al-Qaeda, then Abu al-Kharithi, was driving with 5 other people, and they had a bomb in their car that they were going to use in an attack, but it exploded. That was supposed to be the story that everyone knew. But this was right in November of 2002, and the administration was very eager before the midterms to have a rousing success, and also probably just the thrill that people had in showing off this new toy. Look what we can do. We can strike from anywhere, and we don't even risk at all losing anybody. So they publicized that, and that, our biggest success in Yemen at that point became our biggest failure because President Saleh felt completely burned. He had gone out on a limb to help the United States. He had stove off, domestic disputes about what should we do this, and he said my best bet is to ally with the United States, and he's actually very helpful. But then after that, he didn't find us a reliable partner. I mean, there's always talk, is Saleh a reliable partner, is he not? But you have to also look at it from the Yemeni point of view that Saleh doesn't necessarily trust us after what we did in 2002.
Okay. And what effect would the publicizing of that have had on public attitudes? Although, of course, public attitudes aren't monolithic, but toward both Yemen's government and the United States. Did you get a sense for that?
Yeah, it was. I mean, anybody who doesn't like a president in the Middle East can say they're the United States puppet. That's one of the go-to insults. And in this case, it seemed like how could Saleh argue with that? At that point, he allowed the U.S. to violate his sovereignty, the borders of his nation, send a plane in and kill Yemeni citizens. And so that really hurt him domestically. And in order to regain some of his balance, he then had to turn away and reject a lot of the things that the United States wanted to do in a very public way. And that, also the attitudes to the United States changed. That, the United States thinks they can bomb us. About a year later, we also arrested in Germany in a sting operation a Sheikh Mohammed al-Moyed, who later turned out not to have done anything. But that was a big PR nightmare as well. That, the idea that the U.S. can just come in and do whatever they want to a Yemeni citizen at any time. and that President Saleh was letting them, that hurt. And so his reaction to that also hurt our efforts there.
Okay. So, with all of that as backdrop, let's delve into the current situation in Yemen more broadly. I guess the premise being that it's easier for a group like al-Qaeda to find sanctuary in a country if the country is not effectively governed, and that's, I think you'd agree, a fair description of Yemen. So, what is the state of kind of chaos in Yemen right now?
Well, basically what you have three different layers of problems. And, we can get into each one, but the first layer, I think at the top, the one that people aren't talking about that much, is that President Saleh is getting old. There's no real method of secession, I'm sorry. It's never really been tried before. His two predecessors were both assassinated, one with an exploding suitcase, which tells you a lot about how interesting of a place it is. So there's no real method for what's happening as the old guard of people who have really run the country since the revolution in '62 are dying off. So you have that. Underneath that, you have what's publicized the most, what we like to call the three rebellions, which is a rebellion in the north known as the Houthi rebellion, which are a group of people who are Shiites, but they're not rebelling because they're Shiites, but that's the easy shorthand that we use, Shiite rebellion. Mm-hmm. You have a secession movement in the south, which has never felt that it's economically or militarily part of Yemen, and so they've been rebelling. And then you have the pervasive threat of al-Qaeda throughout the country. So you have those three rebellions. Then underneath that, you have Yemen's just crushing structural problems. Mm-hmm. The country is running out of oil, which is about 75% of its revenue. Its water tables are depleting rapidly. It'll be the first country to run out of water. Close to 65% of the country is under 15 years old. The literacy rates are terrible. Just the demographics of it are creating a nightmare. So any of these problems would be difficult to deal with individually, but right now they're all coming together.
Okay. So leaving aside al-Qaeda for the moment, the southern issue is a secessionist issue per se. They want out of the country. Right. The northern thing involving the Shiites, and this is a sect of Shia, I guess that's what they're called, the Fivers or the Zaidi?
Zaidis, yeah.
Now, well, first of all, does it matter much? Is it much about kind of theology? Does it matter, A, whether they're Fivers as opposed to Twelvers, B, whether they're Shia? Is that really that at the heart of this?
No, it's really not. What's at the heart of it is politics. The Zaidis were the ones who supported, where the Imam essentially came from, the person who ran Yemen, or the family group that ran Yemen for about 1,000 years. And then he was overthrown, and there was a civil war, which was won by the people who wanted a republic.
And that was when?
This was 62.
So until 62, these people who are discontented in the north were running the country.
Right.
And they think it's their birthright.
It's not even necessarily that they want to run the country again. It's that after they were overthrown, they were completely neglected. They went back to their strongholds up north, and the government completely ignored them. And then there was always some tension. There was always tension between the two groups, especially there was a brief Zaidi revival movement after North and South Yemen unified in 1990, and politics started to open up a little bit. Mm-hmm. But then they withdrew from politics. There was some conflict. No one knows who shot first. But since 2004, there's been kind of an ongoing war. And at first it was just battles between these tribesmen and the government. It's mutated in terms of what they want, who they're fighting, who's fighting whom.
What do they say they want now?
Right now they want autonomy, essentially. They want the government. They both want the government to help them rebuild, and they want their autonomy they've had.
They would like some money, but no control.
Right.
No one controlling them.
Right, and they pretty much don't want anything to do with Saleh anymore.
Yeah. And then meanwhile, Saudi Arabia has kind of, in an intermittent way, joined the fight on the side of the government. Is that right?
Right, against the Houthis, who have
because
made
they feel
incursions
threatened
into Saudi
because these guys are right on their border. And
right.
They are not, and they're not Sunnis, and they worry, I guess.
Right.
And, okay, so in effect, both of these movements, I mean, one's maybe is formally a secessionist movement, but they both want to be not under control of the government.
Right. What they have in common, and what they have in common with al-Qaeda, which I think is really interesting, is they're all pretty much challenging existentially the nature of the modern Yemeni state.
Mm-hmm.
They're all questioning whether or not there is legitimacy towards the country of Yemen that we've known for 40 years or, 20-some years in terms of the unified Yemen. And they're basically saying, no, this is historically inaccurate. Even if not in so many words, their actions are calling into question whether or not a modern Yemeni state can actually exist or should actually exist.
So is this not so much about Islamism? In other words, they're not so much insisting that it be a more thoroughly Islamic government?
Right. Certainly in the South, what you have a lot of remnants of the former socialist rule, very secular. So they want, an actual... their calling card is they want an actual democracy. They want a secular republic where everyone is kind of equal. They're not socialist anymore. They're more secular Democrats. So they want that. The Sunni or the Shiite rebellion up north definitely has nothing to do with the Ayatollah. Definitely has nothing to do with the rule of the clerics in Iran.
Well, and there the fact that they're fivers and not 12ers may be a little relevant, right? It makes it a little less likely that they would warm up to the Islamists in Iran.
Right. In terms of theology and a lot of jurisprudence, Zaydism is often referred to as the fifth school of Sunni Islam.
Yeah.
So most Shiites consider them not even really part of Shiism.
Oh, really? So they're kind of almost. And just quickly for our information, what is it that fiver and 12er refers to in Shiite Islam?
Which imam, the original rightly guided caliphs after the Prophet, where you stop thinking that these are good caliphs, essentially.
I see. So they latch on to different points where things went awry in history. Mm-hmm. Is that right?
Yeah, it's all very relevant to what's going on now, weirdly.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, so it sounds like ideologically the guys in the South would be fine with us in principle, right? Secular, they profess democratic ideals.
Mm-hmm.
These are the rebels in the South,
right?
And the ones in the North don't naturally align themselves with our enemies in the it's hard to say sometimes who our enemies are, but anyway, they don't naturally align themselves with the larger threats we see in the region.
Right, exactly.
Although there is a question, I'm wondering how, you said al-Qaeda kind of is trying to infiltrate tribal structures all over the country. I would think that they would have, again, you said the Shia aren't really Shia in a very thoroughgoing and classical sense, but I would have thought that they might have. That might not be a very natural affinity between al-Qaeda and Shiites, just based on the tension that was created by al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia's tactics in Iraq.
Right. No, they're definitely. The three movements certainly don't really have any support for each other.
Okay.
It's more in the central areas of the country where al-Qaeda is managing to insinuate themselves into the tribal system.
I see. So al-Qaeda is not really associated with either of the two other big threats the government faces.
Right. Actually, at one point, al-Qaeda said that they support their southern brethren, not necessarily their goals, but they support the idea of what they're doing. And then the leaders of the South basically said, "Whoa, no, we don't want this endorsement. We don't have anything to do with these people."
Okay. So that's kind of interesting because, for one thing, you hear, it's a chaotic state. You got rebels in the north, rebels in the south, and that's why al-Qaeda, is having an easy time. But actually, those are not the places where al-Qaeda is taking root.
Right, but the problem is, they're distracting the government.
Right.
And it's hard to say distracting the government because, in terms of Yemen, this north and the south are much more important than al-Qaeda. Mm-hmm. They have a much better chance of making the government fall apart, of destroying the country, of tearing it apart. So, in Yemen, in the Yemeni press, al-Qaeda was a sideshow. They're the third most important thing going on there.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So al-Qaeda is able to use this void and use the way the government is trying to deal with the north and the south in order to kind of have their own way.
Okay. But where they're really taking root is in the part of the country that's not resisting centralized rule?
Exactly. It's, they're not resisting centralized rule because centralized rule in a lot of ways is already falling apart in the center of the country.
It was never all that strong to begin with historically, right?
No, it wasn't.
Yeah.
But as the money's running out, as oil revenue is drying up, and there's no money coming in, President Saleh, who has ruled the country through patronage networks, is no longer able to do so. So even without the state itself really, literally imploding and the government falling apart, people are beginning to revert to, all right, we don't have to deal with the government anymore. We're not getting any money from the president, so we're basically going to go our own way now.
Okay. And what is the form that al-Qaeda's presence takes? I mean, are there big camps occupied by al-Qaeda with walls around them, or what?
No, it seems more safe houses. And it's hard to say because it's difficult to get a lot of information from some of the tribal areas. But we don't seem to have any evidence of the same, the people running and doing push-ups and, playing on monkey bars that we saw, coming out of Afghanistan and Iraq. Mm-hmm. We haven't seen anything like that.
I ask because a big question facing us as we try to figure out what to do about threats like this and how important it is to kind of do something quickly is, one question is, how much of an asset is the lack of governance for al-Qaeda? The larger question, and you hear this in the context of Afghanistan and Pakistan, how important is a safe haven to terrorists? Do they need big stretches of land? Do they need badly governed states? Or can they do as much damage from apartments in Germany, where a lot of 9/11 was plotted, as from anywhere? And I know you're not an expert on terrorism, but do you have a view on that based on anything you've seen?
Yeah, I think that definitely does help them because obviously in Germany when the people at September 11th are planning this in their apartments in Munich, the government wasn't paying that much attention to it. But now that the governments of the West it's much harder for them to find a place to operate. Like what the terrorists need is not necessarily people running around and doing push-ups with machine guns on their back. But they need a place where they can meet and operate and plan and discuss things. And what you have in Yemen is certainly a lot like... Well, actually, no, I'm sorry. Let me take that back. It's a lot different than what you had in Afghanistan with the Taliban, because there you had a state structure that was able to provide these, large swaths of training ground for the Taliban.
Right.
What you have in Yemen is, paradoxically, you have basically little mini-state structures now with the tribal areas that they're managing to become a part of. Mm-hmm. So you have some protection, and you have no government who is... as of recently, the government of Yemen has been trying to stop them. But you didn't have any of this government interference. You didn't have any way, for the government to listen in on people, to spy on them. Didn't have the resources to try to infiltrate the group to get information. So you don't have somebody breathing on your shoulder.
So I guess, in a way, the kinds of big camps they had in Afghanistan, they actually had them by virtue of the fact that it actually was an effectively governed country that tolerated the camps. In other words, if they tried to set up big camps in Yemen, they would be easy targets for the drones. Those would not last long.
Exactly, yeah. They could take
because you could take them out without declaring war on the government in this particular case. Mm-hmm. But you're saying that nonetheless, even if you don't have big camps, it's an asset for them to have a base in a chaotic state, because even if we have intelligence, if they're not so exposing themselves to military attack, and yet we have kind of intelligence on them and know where they are, it's hard to act on that intelligence. If we tell the German police we've got good evidence that so-and-so is doing this, they do something, and they have sophisticated technology to gather evidence and eventually to catch them and so on. And that's really the problem in a place like Yemen, is just the lack of effective policing.
Right, and I think you can see, how much easier it was in a way to destroy al-Qaeda in Afghanistan the first go-around than it is to finish them off now that they are running and hiding, especially, in the northwest frontier provinces.
Right. So the training camps are the easy part in terms of, targeting them in a way. And it may not be, I guess neither of us really knows how big an asset those are anyway, you know.
Yeah, I've never really been sure what they've done with it.
Yeah, I don't really know. Okay, so it is a. Let me try to summarize where we are so far. On the one hand, we are not at the, Al Qaeda in the is it in the Arabian Peninsula? What's the formal title of this Al Qaeda?
Yeah, Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula.
Okay. So we're not at the top of their agenda. On the other hand, they do wish us ill because it's good kind of publicity for them to do damage to us. I mean, they're focused more on the near enemy, the Yemen government,
right,
and maybe after that Saudi Arabia. But still,
exactly.
They'd like to do damage. So that's trouble. The fact that it's a badly governed state makes it easier for them, and so worse for us. And yet there's this irony that one source of their strength is alienation from the government, so that to the extent that we try to make the country better governed by aligning ourselves with the government, we may be further turning the populace against us, and possibly making it easier for Al-Qaeda to gain financing and so on by reinforcing the idea that they are one of our enemies.
Yes, exactly.
Huh. So this is a total mess then.
This is, yes. That's the best way to describe it.
Do you have, and of course so you could focus on a number of things. You could try to rebuild the country. You could try to kill a bunch of militants. What do you think we should be doing right now?
Well, I mean, I think what we're doing on the military side, it is essential because Yemen wouldn't be able to find these people on their own. Where there was just an article in the Post today, kind of a couple people were sort of leaking information about the cooperation between the U.S. and the Yemeni governments. We're providing intelligence and weapons and tactics. We're not actually going ahead and shooting the missiles ourselves, but we're doing everything but. And I think it is important to do that. But the problem is, especially in the early part of last decade, after September 11th, we focused on Yemen entirely in terms of security issues. And in doing so, the security issues became much worse. So what we have to do, I think people are realizing that Yemen needs a lot of help. It needs to be rebuilt. The country has no money, and it's running out of water, which is the most elemental problem you can have, literally, I guess. And so what we really need to do is to focus on rebuilding, both morally, that's helpful to do to people who are, living in dire poverty and things are just going to get worse. But even strategically, you change the face of U.S. power in Yemen. Right now, the face of U.S. power is drones. If that can be changed to helping to rebuild the country, possibly providing political solutions in the north and the south, and using our capacity for good in our favor, that might help people turn away from Al-Qaeda. So both strategically and morally, focusing, at least publicly, far more on Yemen's structural challenges is the right thing to do.
Although, it sounds like turning away from Al-Qaeda, a lot of that, there's two other players. There's America and there's the Yemeni government. If Yemen's government itself were seen as trying to do good and not being corrupt and so on, that itself would turn people away from Al-Qaeda, right?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. We definitely have to try
But it sounds like you think the Yemeni government cannot do that alone. It needs outside help, and one benefit of us being part of the outside help would be the further advantage that in addition to turning people away from Al-Qaeda, it would mute popular antagonism toward us.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. I know it sounds like a cliche, but I've never had a problem, even in ostensibly anti-American rallies in Sana'a, I've never had a problem with being there.
And they knew you were American?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no one's ever said anything, no one said as much as boo at any point, And this was during Abu Ghraib. This was when, Israel assassinated a couple Hamas leaders. So tension was running really high. But, I don't think people are inherently anti-American. I think, that's, you hear about that all over the world. People don't like what the government does, but they don't hate America.
Speaking of Israel, is that a big issue that far away from Israel? That's the part of the Arab world that is just about the farthest from Israel? I'm not good at geography. Is that...
yeah, it's pretty far.
Pretty far. Is it a... I mean, my sense... I've traveled in Saudi Arabia. My sense was there it's a big issue. What's the deal in Yemen?
It's an emotional issue, but I wouldn't say it's at the top of the list at all.
Mm-hmm.
People have much more to deal with on their own turf.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Nobody liked when Israel assassinates some Hamas leaders. People don't like what's happening in Gaza, but it's not really on the top of the agenda.
Mm-hmm.
Even in the Houthi rebellion, they say, Salah's a puppet of America and Israel, but that's just, that's just an emotion. That's like saying terrorist here. You can just use that. Or,
actually, that word is pretty powerful here.
It's a powerful word, but it doesn't necessarily mean you think somebody's a terrorist or it's the thing you care about the most.
Right. So rebuilding. So you would say that at the top of the list is restoring both effective and legitimate, that is, respected governance in Yemen. It's going to take outside help. Now, as we speak, there's actually a conference in London where European nations are talking about this very thing, I gather?
They are, yeah. They're trying to figure out the best way to do it. And I was a little nervous about it at first because it seemed like it was going to be entirely high level. And when it's entirely high level like that, I think people focus more on the immediate threat of al-Qaeda.
Mm-hmm.
But I read their draft statement that they released this morning, and they actually seem to be focusing on good governance and economic help and aid and rebuilding, helping, not even just rebuilding, but building the country, which...
So are there... do you have a clear idea of what kind of plan they're going to proceed with, if any?
It seems to me that they're going to say, yeah, we have to fight al-Qaeda, but then we have to find political solutions to the north and the south, and we're going to implement, we're going to have, hopefully, a series of benchmarks that Saleh has to meet in terms of reform. And I think that can be successful. The problem is, and this isn't a fully fleshed out thought, this is something I've been kicking around for the last couple of weeks, that I don't know that we will ever get to a point where there will be a central government that controls all of Yemen.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the rebellions that we've seen in the last couple of years have more or less let the cat out of the bag.
Mm-hmm.
That this is not something that's going to ever happen in Yemen.
Yeah.
People don't want that. It's not part of Yemen's history. So I think what we can do is not quite federalism, but almost a devolution, and a gentle devolution, trying to aid that.
So, partition ultimately, maybe.
Possibly,
or just autonomy as opposed to sovereignty on the part of those
exactly.
two regions.
Exactly. I think that's much more natural in Yemen. And like I said, this is something I've just kind of been kicking around, and I'm not positive. But in the Senate hearing last week, one of the administration's counterterrorism aides actually was talking about methods that they were using to promote local governance rather than federal governance.
Mm-hmm. And does the central government deserve a fair amount of the wrath directed toward? In other words, is it like actively corrupt or just kind of incompetent, or is it being blamed for things largely beyond its control, like water tables that are disappearing and oil that's disappearing?
It's both. See, when I mentioned earlier that President Saleh's two predecessors were both assassinated, and the one before him was pretty much politely asked to leave lest the same thing happen. Saleh has spent most of his time trying to manage staying in power, which is understandable given that he doesn't want to be killed.
And given that every other politician in human history has been focused on that.
Exactly, yeah. And so, he builds these, he builds these patronage networks, and he puts a lot of his loyal tribesmen in positions of power so that they won't overthrow him. And he's so focused on that, then he's also focused on a ton of immediate emergencies, because it seems like there's a crisis every 2 or 3 years in Yemen. So what he's been doing is both focusing on the immediate ones and trying to stay in power and kicking the can down the road. And now they've pretty much run out of road. And so I think that's the problem. So it's both Yemeni history and just the mess of problems that they just cannot be avoided any longer. And they've all come to a head right now. And I think Saleh views himself, I've always compared him to, you know, Yoweri Museveni in Uganda, like somebody who thinks that they are the only ones who can take the state to a good place. Like, I think Saleh actually wants to make Yemen a better place, but he doesn't trust that anyone else can. So his focus on staying in power is both cynical and vaguely, weirdly idealistic.
I think people generally tend to justify their goals in terms of the greater good.
Yeah, that's true.
I suspect Saddam Hussein genuinely thought that he was acting in the interests of the Iraqi state.
Yeah, that's a good point.
But maybe that's just me. But it worries me a little how analogous this sounds to Afghanistan in the sense that, okay, you've got the same. Okay, we've got a situation in Afghanistan where we're saying, well, okay, on the one hand, we've got to be, killing these guys, even though, we've got a government that's unpopular in Afghanistan. But its enemies are our enemies. Mm-hmm. And that's a problem right there. Figuring out how to handle that is a problem. Our approach is, well, okay, we're going to kill the bad guys on the one hand, and that may have unfortunate effects, both in the sense that collateral damage comes back, hurts us in public opinion there when we kill civilians, and in the sense that we are seen as backing a government that's unpopular. But our plan is we're going to restore effective and legitimate governance and ultimately redeem the Afghan government in the eyes of the people while we're killing these guys. And one thing we're finding out is it's actually very hard to control what the government there at least does. We would like for them not to steal elections, but we don't seem to be able to stop that, And I'm wondering if you can reassure me that for some reason in Yemen, it's a little more likely that this awkward and in some ways counterproductive alliance with the government can ultimately turn out well.
I think so far, and I might be grasping at straws if you need total reassurance, because I'm not assured myself. I think so far they've made the right gestures anyway, in rejecting the idea that all of Saleh's enemies are our enemies as well. They've made it very clear that he's not going to be using our drones, our planes to stop the Houthis or the southern secessionists. They've taken great pains to say, there needs to be a political solution to this. They aren't our problem as well. We're concerned about al-Qaeda, we're concerned about the future of your country, but that doesn't give you carte blanche to use our help to destroy your other enemies who might have legitimate points and certainly don't have anything against the United States. So I think they're doing a good job with that in isolating al-Qaeda and in letting Saleh, not giving Saleh a blank check to do whatever it is that he'd like to do. The difficulty, of course, is that, how do you control the money? And they say they're going to make sure that they have an eye on the money, but that always works better in theory than in practice. And I think one big difference with Yemen and Afghanistan, or Yemen and Somalia, Yemen and Iraq, is that historically, ethnically, linguistically, culturally, Yemen is not divided. It's divided politically, and it's divided in terms of what people want the state to be, or if they even want a state. But for thousands of years, there's always been a sense of we are a Yemeni people. And so I think that is what we have working in our favor. We're not trying to cobble together peoples. We're just trying to cobble together people.
Although, fault lines that begin as political, when they coincide with ethnic fault lines, which these to some extent do, certainly in the case of the Shia right, can get deeper. I mean, some people think that in Iraq, before al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia started blowing up Shiite mosques, the Sunni and Shia were doing a pretty good job of getting along. So I'm just saying, it's you can't take anything for granted there. But and what about? I mean, does it seem that we will have an easier time than we've had in Afghanistan of getting the government to do things that are more conducive to its legitimacy in the eyes of the people?
I think so. I think one thing about President Saleh that you can never take away from him is that Where the wind blows, so does he. That's one of his guiding principles is, I will do what it takes. So I think now he realizes he has an out. And now he realizes that the world is willing to help him, and they see him as the only person who can hold the country together. So if he can use this opportunity to negotiate with the Houthis to find a political solution that the rest of the world might pay for and might help out with, because he doesn't want the country to fall apart either. Because especially in the south, I mean, that's the port of Aden is still one of the major sources of revenue in the country. So once, if the South were to leave, and there's a lot of oil fields in the South, he's not going to be able to afford to pay off people anymore to keep his patronage networks. So it is in his interest to keep the country together, and it's in his interest now to work with the donors and to say, see, I told you all along, you should have been paying attention and giving me money. So he might be able to maintain to use our money to buy back his legitimacy. And I think he sees that as a survival strategy.
Take us through your dream scenario. For one thing, beginning with kind of now that the world gets that Europe and the United States kind of gets the picture about the importance of restoring stable and legitimate governance to the extent that is ever going to work there. Kind of what happens next? Is it a highly multilateral thing in terms of what's at least remotely feasible and corresponds with what you think would be good? Would it be some kind of joint U.S.-European initiative and kind of a big rollout where we say to the people of Yemen, okay, things are going to be different. Give us a chance. Give the government a chance. Or what should happen next?
Well, I think what we need to do is to engage the society on all levels. And there's been signs that they're talking about doing that. Certainly help with good federal governance, but then realize that even if, we build a very strong central government, it's always going to chafe. So what you do is you work in the tribal areas, local governance projects, building wells, trying to restore the water supply. And I think one of the main things that we have to do is not just an American and European face helps, but both pragmatically and in terms of how it'll work strategically, get the Gulf Cooperation Council involved. And they've made noises that they are willing to get involved finally to try to avoid having a failed state on their same peninsula. They finally come around to realize that this is something that's probably important, and since they're building islands in the ocean, that maybe they can spend a little money in Yemen as well. So I think that's really important to put more of an Arab face onto it.
And does this plausibly lead to the extinction of al-Qaeda in Yemen eventually?
Possibly eventually. A missile strike isn't going to cut off their head, right? Even if it kills al-Waq or al-Raymi, unless you manage to get, 8 or 10 of the top leadership, it's not going to go away. So what you have to do is fight against the militants carefully, strategically, surgically, and then help to stop another generation. Because if all we do is destroy al-Qaeda right now, and for the sake of argument's sake, we could destroy every single al-Qaeda member in the country. If that's all we focus on in Yemen, we'll be dealing with the third generation, the fourth generation. We'll be having this conversation again in 10 years.
And is there any is there any trade-off there, though? In other words, if ultimately we are struggling for the hearts and minds of the people, and you're saying al-Qaeda has already successfully insinuated their members in tribal structures, how easy is it to kind of pick these guys off with drones without generating counterproductive sentiment?
It's not easy at all. It's very difficult to do so, but it's not. I don't think it's entirely impossible. They had a couple guys isolated, including Qasim al-Raymi, who's the really scary guy, who's the military leader. They had him isolated with a few other people, and they just basically missed. The Yemeni government did. They're not known for precision.
But you would say in terms of, by they, you mean what? Who was controlling the strikes?
We provided the intelligence, and Yemen enacted the strike, and they missed.
With our technology?
No, with theirs, I believe.
So they didn't have, like, drones or...
It doesn't seem like that was a drone strike.
Right.
It seemed like that was a...
But we are doing drone strikes with our technology there?
We've done several drone strikes, yes, so far.
And is that kind of worse than just having their military do it from our public relations, from our point of view in terms of winning hearts and minds?
Well, see, that's the tricky balance, because we are much more likely to be able to have surgical strikes with less collateral damage. But then, it's also, hey, this is an American bombing it. I think what's weird, though, that we kind of have to think about is that whatever happens, people are going to believe that America was behind it.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of me thinks if people are going to believe that anyway, at least we can do it more efficiently.
Mm-hmm.
Even if we completely backed off and the Yemeni government was just throwing missiles, randomly around the tribal areas, people would still believe that America was behind it.
Uh-huh.
So I think we can go up to the edge of how much help we can give, since we're going to take the flak for it anyway.
I guess. I don't know how the propaganda works out, but including in the larger kind of Arab world when it's on, Al Jazeera and stuff. But in any event, there's a sufficiently high cost, it sounds like, to things like collateral damage that your threshold for a strike, in terms of evidence, in terms of confidence that you've got the people isolated and they're the right people, the threshold should be pretty high.
It would be fair, yes. I think one of the main things that we have to do is treat al-Qaeda in Yemen the way it's treated inside Yemen, which is a problem, but you can almost say more of a symptom of the huge structural problems.
Mm-hmm.
Because, focusing entirely on the security will make security the only important thing.
So in the long run, something like, not very much like, but something in the spirit of a Marshall Plan, in other words, a
Exactly.
rebuilding of governance and infrastructure and so on, is the fundamental cure.
Exactly.
But I would think that al-Qaeda is going to want to sabotage that, right?
I think they are, and they definitely would like to, but again, they are facing the same problem in a lot of ways that the government is facing. Is that even if you have areas of sympathy, you don't have the entire country.
Mm-hmm.
They're not capable enough to really have a concerted series of attacks around the country that can really waylay, that can ankle the rebuilding efforts.
Yeah. Of course, the other question is, wouldn't that somewhat dim their popularity if you're trying to build a school and they blow it up? Although, insurgents do this so often around the world that I must be missing something,
Well, and I think that's the interesting, and we talked before about what separates them from Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia is that AQIM's total wanton disregard for human life,
right,
and the fact that they were not really from Iraq,
right,
had the people eventually turn against them. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula has been so much smarter than that, the way they've managed to become part of the society.
Uh-huh.
That they, for a while, a couple of years ago, I was thinking that they would overreach and eat their young, so to speak, that the revolution would immolate itself. But that hasn't happened because they're smart enough not to do that. Like, I would be very surprised to see them blow up a school or, throw acid in the face of girls who are trying to get an education.
But that's both good news and bad news. It's good news that they're not bloodthirsty and that you don't get that kind of carnage, but it means that in a way they're a more formidable and less self-defeating enemy.
Right. They're very patient and very smart, and they're growing more sophisticated, it seems almost weekly. But I think if you can keep them on the run and keep them off balance, you might be able to buy yourself time to at least begin to diminish some of their influence.
And they are more robust now than they were in Phase 1 before we kind of confined them and locked them up and they did that prison break. It's now kind of containment per se is no longer a plausible sole strategy.
Right. Before, like, the first generation, the so-called first generation, they were willing to participate in the time-honored Yemeni tradition of negotiations with the government and exchanges and, you scratch our back, we'll scratch yours, and we won't, make an attack here if you don't arrest us here. That's the way the game was played in Yemen. But these guys, as much as they're part of Yemeni culture, have also rejected that idea of dealing with the government, which both makes them sort of more popular and makes them much more dangerous.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, it sounds like we do have a mess. Not the only one in the world.
No.
But you've done a great job of shedding light on it, and it sounds like everyone should be reading your blog, which is called what again?
It's called Waq al-Waq.
Waq al-Waq. I do like the name. I like the name more than the URL, I've got to say.
Yeah, the URL.
The URL a little unwieldy.
It is. It doesn't flow off the tongue, and nobody's going to accidentally stumble upon it by typing it in.
So they're better off. Well, we will link to the blog on the side of the video, but they're better off Googling Waq al-Waq blog than they are trying to commit the URL to memory. Now, the URL is a series of English words, but
it's a lot of them jammed together.
It's a long series. Okay. Well, listen. Thanks a lot,
Bob. Thank you. I've really enjoyed this.
It's been I've learned a lot. And keep it up.
Thank you.
See you around.